The festivals are upon us yet again, and so I thought it's probably about time for another installment for our Festival Edition playlist. So we started with Purim last year. That's where this whole playlist got started. And so I'll link part one. There was a two-part discussion, a two-part video last year. I'm going to link part one and part two in the comments below in the description of this video. And we had a great conversation back then. We talked about a lot of things, appropriation and supersessionism and all kinds of stuff about that. But I just wanted to focus in on some of the content of Purim for this year. So just one video this year as we get ready for Purim here in just a few days. And probably set up some conversation maybe for next year's Purim video. So we'll see how we go there. But Purim, if you remember, and again, go back and review those earlier videos. Purim is the celebration of the story of Esther, the book of Esther in the Bible, and how the Jews were saved from the Persians and Haman and his plot against the Jews and all of that stuff. And this is an incredible story. I remember recommending in that first set of videos Rabbi Fohrman's book, The Queen You Thought You Knew. It's one of my favorite books and favorite reads. I'm probably going to mention it again today. I'll probably try to drop a link to that in the description of the video as well. But somebody recently sent me a message on one of our platforms, and they had noticed something in Esther chapter 6. Esther chapter 6. Haman is brought in because Mordecai is going to be honored, right? Mordecai is going to be honored because he saved the king's life back in chapter 2. He uncovered a conspiracy. Haman's brought in. He thinks he's going to be honored, but the story flips, and then Mordecai, his arch nemesis, gets honored instead. And right in the middle of Esther chapter 6, verse 8, it says this, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one of the royal crest placed on his head, and then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights it to honor, and lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what was done for the man that the king delights to honor. Now, this person, she wrote me a message saying, I'm seeing really thick parallels to Genesis 41 in the story of Joseph. And she couldn't be more right. There are parallels all throughout the story of Esther to the story of Joseph. I mean, they are everywhere. One of my favorite chapters to see them is chapter 2. So if you go back to chapter 2 of Esther, you have this story, and here's some of the things that we read. Tell me where you've heard this before. So this is Esther. Esther is in the middle of this beauty pageant contest thing, and we're told this. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with the beauty treatments and of special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids to the best place of the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard in the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So Esther gets put in charge of the entire harem. If you go back and compare that to Joseph being put in charge of the prison, it's almost identical. It's like the same exact kind of wording. Think about that passage. She keeps her identity a secret, just like Joseph kept his identity a secret. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Esther won the favor. Very, very same language to what we read about as Joseph when he was in prison and won the favor of the person in charge of the prison, and then won the favor of Pharaoh. What about, which then leads us to the connection in Esther 6 we just read, right? When the virgins were assembled the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. There are so many parallels to the story of Joseph all throughout the book of Esther. And those connections are too many to be coincidence, and they're definitely intentional by the author. So one of the things we can wrestle with during the story of Purim and the celebration of Purim, which remember, if you watched those earlier videos, Purim is a raucous party. It's an incredible celebration. It's full of fun. It's not this deep, somber learning, Bible study. It's a time of great celebration and one of the biggest parties of the year. And yet in the midst of that, or underneath all of that, what the party and the celebration is grounded on is a story that really invites us to consider some deep and meaningful things. So why is the story of Esther connected to the story of Joseph? Well, on some level, it makes complete sense. Joseph is a story about persevering in the midst of a foreign empire. Joseph is in Egypt. Esther is in Persia. Joseph is going to have to persevere no matter what comes his way and make it through the suffering and the trial to see the vision of God realized. Esther's having to do the exact same thing. So on some level, there's a conversation about Esther and Joseph both being conversations about what does it mean to persevere and to remain obedient in the midst of empire. All right? Now, that conversation can go a few different directions. One of my favorite conversations is Walter Brueggemann did a book, Out of Babylon. Out of Babylon by Walter Brueggemann. And what he suggested, and I think completely accurately, is that Esther has a particular paradigm, a philosophy, a worldview that it represents to the people of God. It is what he called the Accommodation-Resistance paradigm. The Accommodation-Resistance. How do you live in the midst of empire? It's one thing to live in Judah or Israel with your temple and your freedom and independence and your religion and your faith. It's something else to live in Persia without your temple, without your same freedoms, without your faith. What does it mean to live in the midst of empire? And Brueggemann says that the narrative here is trying to teach us how to accommodate that lifestyle and simultaneously resist the idolatry and the pull of empire. How do you accommodate and resist at the same time? And Esther is a blueprint for that kind of study and consideration. Some scholars, and this will probably go further than some of us will be comfortable with, maybe even myself included, some have suggested that the story of Joseph is actually an additional story added to the book of Genesis later, based on real true events, like literally there's a Joseph in the family of God and all that kind of stuff, but that the story of Joseph as it's told in the book of Genesis has been shaped by the people of God's time in Babylon in captivity. So Joseph, the story that we're seeing connected to Esther, could be trying to tell the exact same narrative to God's people and teach the exact same lessons. And that could be entirely true. And what I love about that, not the Genesis part, like if you love that idea, great. If you hate that idea, great. It's neither here nor there. My point is to show the similarities again between the Joseph story and the Esther story, and to consider what the lessons are, what the meaning is that we're supposed to take away from those stories. I digress. If the book of Esther and the story of Purim and the celebration of Purim is about considering what it means to live in the midst of empire, then not only is it unbelievably relevant for people like you and me today, but then the same stuff that what I hope to get into next year. We'll talk more about this next year for Purim, but when I recommended the book, The Queen You Thought You Knew by Rabbi Fohrman, one of the things that he's going to go to great length to do is to show you how unbelievably shrewd, how brilliant, how wise Esther is, and Mordecai. But this Esther character, what she's doing is unbelievably intentional, it's calculated, and it's shrewd. She has the empire of Persia eating out of her hand. by the time that book is over. And you don't see it on the surface. I doubt many of you, without the help of rabbis and those kind of things, we probably don't see that necessarily on the surface. We might have some hunches. We might think that's what's going on. Fohrman does a great job of using Jewish tradition to show what's happening in the story of Esther. She's unbelievably wise. She's unbelievably shrewd. And she's making an impact in the midst of Persia because of it. So it's a fantastic study. I love it. And you should get that book. I'll put a link in the description and read up on it for yourself. It will, again, blow your mind. But the last thing I would say, and Fohrman also includes this in his book, is that if this is a story of Joseph, there are other connections too. If Esther is essentially a retelling of the story, a parallel telling of the story of Joseph, there are other connections that are also important. Because the story of Joseph is ultimately a story of forgiveness, of reconciliation of God's family. And not just the fact that Joseph forgives his brothers. Yes, but even more so than that, the story of Joseph is really not even the story of Joseph. And Rabbi Fohrman does this in other teachings as well. He shows how the story of Joseph is actually the story of Judah and Benjamin. Because Judah and Benjamin have a relationship that at the beginning of the story, the sons of Rachel are at odds with Judah. And Judah does not start off the story well. But Judah learns some lessons and ends up coming around to being willing to confess that he's wrong and then put his own neck on the line to help save the family. And it's that self-sacrifice. It's that laying down of his life on behalf of a brother he didn't even like when the story began. It's that movement that actually provokes Joseph. Joseph doesn't just make a decision to forgive in a vacuum. Joseph is provoked to forgiveness because of the humility and the contrite heart displayed in Judah. And so what you see in the book of Esther and the story of Purim and the celebration of Purim is you see Mordecai going to Esther and saying, Esther, we have to remember the history of our family. And right now, the word he uses is, we just read the Jews. The Jews need you. Well, the word he actually uses is the word for Judeans, or in other words, Judaans. The people of Judah need you. But who is Esther and Mordecai? Well, they're Benjamites. They're from the tribe of Benjamin. But Benjamin was saved all of those centuries ago because of the humility and compassion of Judah. And now Mordecai is telling Benjamin that they have to...
Sorry, I don't know that one.
Just ignore my Alexa going off in the background. Judah is now having to pay... Benjamin now gets the opportunity to pay Judah back for the things that they did years and years and years ago. And there's all this subtext happening in the story of Esther. And so what is our takeaway here in this video? Part of what the story and the celebration of Purim reminds us and teaches us is that if we're going to live effectively in the midst of empire, if we are going to accommodate and resist the world, if we are going to simultaneously accommodate and resist the world in which we live, we are going to have to be very, very good at being humble, at being contrite, at being people that are good at forgiveness. Particularly, maybe even forgiveness of our own brothers and sisters. And honestly, right now, I can't think of a more relevant, provocative, and challenging lesson. Because if you've been on Facebook, if you've been to church recently, if you run in Christian circles, we have taken up sides about every issue from COVID to masks to politics to everything you can possibly imagine. And we have one side and another side, and boy, do we hate the other side. If we're going to live effectively in a world of empire, we are going to have to figure out how to humble ourselves and see those brothers and sisters that we don't necessarily get along with, and try to figure out how to restore the family of God. And that's a huge can of worms to open up and then end a video. But that's my meditation for Purim this year. I hope it gives you something to chew on and think about and consider. And my video today just scratched the surface. You probably need to buy a book or two if you really want to wrestle with this. If you're provoked and are like, okay, I need to know more. Well, don't just leave a bunch of comments. Go buy a book or two in the description and see what you dig up and what you find and what you see as you study the book of Esther yourself. So until the next time, I look forward to discussing what's the next festival going to be. Passover? I'll look forward to talking about Pesach soon. Talk to you then.